Thanks for having me. Thanks for bringing me over. So the training algorithm for me is this what I call the speed tree, right? The tree's upside down for a reason, so it's going to kind of branch out from the top piece here. But it is, like I said, the single most important trainable quality in hockey. Virtually everything else we work on is somehow related to speed, whether it's strength, whether it's power, whether it's fitness, whether it's body composition. All of these lead back up the tree to improving speed. That's how I think about our training program and how I think about our profiling and testing. So let me try to walk you through this. It's not super complex, but the first question I just ask is, are you fast? And it's a yes or no question. So if you're fast, we'll work down the left side of the algorithm here. So if you're fast, are you fit? Yes or no? If it's no, work on conditioning. If it's yes, are you lean? Are you lean? Yes or no? No. Get leaner. Recomposition. Yes. Tactics. Okay, the tree just ended. That route's dead. We don't need to keep wasting time with this athlete, getting them bigger, faster, stronger, right? We want to move them to the tactics piece as fast as possible. Okay? We don't want this physical process to drag on for years. We want to allocate as many resources to tactics as possible. So that's a really nice pathway straight to tactics. It's over. In terms of slow, so are you fast? No. Are you strong? Yes or no? No. Get stronger. Are you powerful? Yes or no? No. Do some rate of force development training. Do some power training. Are you powerful? Yes. Focus on the technical aspects of training, technical aspects of skating, pardon me. Okay, so it's a very quick decision tree to get us to what we have to focus on first. And once we've worked our way down to that end box, we simply reassess and we start back at the top. Are you fast? Okay, and this process repeats itself until we can answer yes. So the KPIs on ice for me, probably a little bit like Martin just touched on, right? But acceleration is the most important one for me. Okay? Because I talked about the game being won and lost within 10 meters, it's going to be about acceleration and likely change of direction. So they're 1 and 2 on my list. The ability to repeat that, again, it's those same two things, but being repeated over and over and over. So now we're talking about a conditioning aspect. That's critical. Maximum velocity is certainly less important. A, because it doesn't get used in the game, and B, it's hard to train for us, but it just doesn't get utilized in the game very often. So it's a little bit lower down the list. However, we know that if we can raise that ceiling a little bit, your operational capacity is a little bit higher. Okay, so game speed is around 6 or 7 meters per second on average. So if your max speed comes up, we know that you're functioning at a slightly lower percent of max, so that's a good thing in terms of efficiency. So let me walk through this. Acceleration, we talk about that in terms of a 0 to 6 meters per second. Okay, so it's not a super high speed, but it's a nice analogy to a car. So we're still sort of building this language in our sport. We don't have a culture and a history of sports science and ice hockey. So it's a nice round number for me to talk to coaches and general managers about how people accelerate, how athletes accelerate. They don't know what a meter per second is. But 0 to 60 is sort of common vernacular, right, with cars, at least in America. 0 to 6 sort of makes sense to them. But 6 is also closely related to game speed. So we want to look at how fast you can get from 0 to 6. Okay? How fast can you go from 6 to 10? So we call that change of pace. So you're cruising in the game, something opens up. Can you accelerate on the fly? Test for that for us, linear 20-meter sprint. Okay, so we've played with 20, we've played with 30. We feel that 20 is appropriate enough. Okay, we're not looking, and we're not achieving max speed in 30 either, and I'll talk about that in a second. But for us, we're really, really focused on 0 to 20 meters. And we can get a lot of information out of their acceleration abilities from that test. Change of direction, obviously that's a stop, start, start, or stop, start, stop, start. You guys got me? We look at linears and arcs. So again, like I said, the game is won and lost in 10 meters, so you're going to have to change direction at some point. We're confined to this ice surface with walls, so you don't get to go in a straight line very long. We use a 10-0-10. a little bit like Martin talked about, we needed a little bit more distance to achieve some velocity into the stop and start. But I also like the symmetry of the 20 meters. I know a 15:05 is also 20 meters, but it just worked well for us, and it's something that we've been able to play with a little bit. So that's a really important test for us. And we're also playing with a new test that's called an arc sprint. So we're working on a similar distance, but we're taking that through a turn. I'll show some examples on the next slide, but just working through some curves. And then repeat sprint ability is one that unfortunately, we don't get a lot of access to our athletes on ice. For those of you who may or may not know, there's a lot of rules with collective bargaining agreement, players associations. So we are still fairly limited in terms of how much on-ice testing we can do, but we've played with what we call a 3-lap test. It's pretty brutal. It's 1 lap of the ice, a full lap, stop, repeat another lap, stop, add a 3rd lap. And so from that, we're obviously getting 3 consecutive repetitions. We can achieve some sort of understanding of fatigue index. We can see how velocity drops off, and there's some heart rate parameters that are associated with that. And the max velocity for us, really just looking at their max speed potential. Like I said, games don't move at that type of speed, but we want to understand what that capacity is, and we want to know what their speed reserve is. We just simply do a flying lap. A 30-meter sprint, we're getting very close, but unfortunately, with a hockey rink, it's only 200 feet long. At that speed, they get very close to the end wall. It gets pretty dangerous, and we've actually had athletes fall at high speeds. It's kind of scary, so we allow them to just wind up and then really let it sort of rip down the backstretch, and just, it's very decontextualized, but we can get a good understanding of max speed, and we track that through GPS. A couple other points here on subjective. These are things that we can't quantify in the field in terms of how they apply to the sport, but strength, recovery, agility, mobility. Again, it comes back to that eyeball test. Strong athletes tend to be able to combat the opponent fairly well. For whatever reason, there's guys who are very gym strong, but also end up on their backside often. So there's this sort of hockey strong. It's kind of hard to quantify, right? But people who know it know it. So the KPIs on ice, I've touched on most of them. I want to talk just briefly about what the measures are, and some of them aren't very sexy, but I was actually happy that Martin talked about time, because time's all that matters, right? So we can do meters per second for an accelerate, or meters per second squared for acceleration, but really all that matters is how quickly you get there, and time's a really simple one, right? So in a 20-meter sprint, total time is really important. Okay, so we'll look at a 10-meter split and a 20-meter split. It doesn't have to be more complicated. Of course, there's some sexier numbers that we want to look at and that we want to use in terms of tracking training. Okay, so the secondaries for us, I really like the ratio of force value. It's tricky. That comes from JB's force velocity profile. It's built into the Sprint software. It's a little tricky with skaters because they're kind of moving all the time. So often when we do our sprints, they'll sort of trip the wire, so to speak. But we're able to clean that in the cases we have to. But we see really, really good correlation between the athletes who can really explode on the first step and actually get to that 10 or 20 meter line fastest. We're really tuned in on stride lengths and stride frequencies, and are starting to map out motor preferences. So the relative stride lengths and stride frequencies and what their strategy is to accelerate. Obviously now with the new Sprint software, there's some amazing data there that we can work with and start to map that motor preference out. And then through some biomechanics software, we're sort of focused on trunk angle, shin angle, and touchdown angle. We want to know how they're sort of positioning their body through acceleration. In the 10-0-10, it's the same thing. We want to know time to 10 meters, time to 20 meters. Right. And then we look at the relationship to the 20-meter sprint. Some of the secondary KPIs, we want to know stride length, stride frequency again. We want to look at the projection angle in the turn steps. So as soon as they've turned and project out, what are their trunk angles? What are their shin angles? So are they projecting up? Are they projecting too horizontal? There's a sweet spot in there. It's around 45 degrees for us. Okay, and again, we'll look at first step acceleration. In the arc sprint, again, it's time, okay? Not super sexy, but we'll also break those down. So one of the things I like through change of direction in arc turns, I want to sort of know entry-exit speeds. So how fast are they coming into a turn, and how fast can they come out of the turn? So really clean skaters. So just like a skier, I know there's some skiing folks in here, but can they hold an edge? Can they take a turn clean, or are they skidding and really sliding through a turn and having to get back on the gas after the turn? So that's a really important thing from a movement strategy standpoint. 3-lap test, again, total time. We'll look at fatigue index across the 3 efforts. We're looking at how peak velocities drop off. Okay, so we should have, and players pace themselves, I know that. So, but we'll look at how those peak velocities drop off across 3 efforts. What's their max heart rate, and then what's their 3-minute recovery. In terms of max velocity, flying laps, or the 20-meter fly lap, or fly 20, max speed. So we feel pretty confident that we get that captured when they do the lap. So as long as if we're doing a fly 20 with timing gates, that's one thing. Obviously, we rely on GPS for that, but we're fairly confident that we're capturing that information. But again, we'll use some camera-based analysis, and we'll look at stride length, stride frequencies through maximum velocity skating. So that's a lot different than acceleration, obviously. And then again, some biomechanical assessment of the angles. So here's just a sample of our 20-meter sprint. So I've got actually an athlete loaded up here. His acceleration isn't super pretty. He's got a very high leg kick on return, which is, I don't know if he's learned that from a track coach or something. He's Slovakian, young guy. He's actually the fastest skater we've ever recorded at max velocity. So he had an 11.42, which is insanely fast. It's crazy that the difference between 10.5 and 11.5 is 2 different sports for us. So if you're really in tune with some of these numbers, most of our players that are at 10.5 are dog slow. But obviously there's some really great stuff here. So we have the tracing from his sprint there below. Lots of different shapes, okay? So we see very high peaks, low valleys. We see things that are slightly flatter. I would call this more of a flat profile, which I like. It means he's able to stay in acceleration between strides longer, okay? So some long striders will actually decelerate between strides. So we want to make sure that they're sort of on the gas throughout that acceleration phase. You may see something here which is similar to what Martin showed actually in the rehab state, but hockey players are inherently asymmetrical. Okay, so we don't see perfect symmetry left and right. The reason is they hold a stick. Okay, so there's different movement strategies to the left and right stride based on which hand you hold the stick. It's normal. We won't flush that out. We just want to make sure it remains within a normal boundary, and usually upper and lower limits of 10% is fine. But it's something to acknowledge. It's going to be asymmetrical. And again, just a sample table off to the right that is where we're getting some of the stride length, stride frequency data from, and that's what we're mapping out on the motor preference stuff. Moving to the off ice, a little bit more general. Obviously, it's a full body athlete. We talked about developing all aspects of their physical capacities. Lower bodies of primary importance, upper body secondary. We start with lower body max force. Okay, so speed we know comes from the ability to generate high forces, generate those high forces quickly, apply them in the right direction. First one here is lower body max force. We emphasize unilateral, we emphasize frontal plane. Obviously the exercise here that we've selected and the test that we've sort of, I don't know, quote unquote, developed is the isokinetic lateral squat. So there'll be video of that. Really important exercise for us, important test. It's one and the same. Okay? So we're using that as an evaluation tool, we're using it as a training tool, and we're continually monitoring it. Lower body max power. So we're looking at rate of force development, explosive displacement of the center of mass, highly correlated with the ability to accelerate on ice. We'll test that on force plates. So it's a counter movement jump, hands on hips protocol. We do a 3-jump protocol. First one body weight, second one with 25% of their weight added to a bar, and then we'll go as heavy as 50%. we'll use that for a linear regression to do some load velocity profiling as well. So pretty basic stuff. Upper body max force, we use the quantum again. So now we're doing a press. We've modified a handle. So one of the things that you kind of struggle with a traditional handle attachment is the small loop, and the cord will actually kind of rub against the body of the athlete. So we've just taken an extra piece of cord, and it's about a meter and a half long. So it gives it a little bit of space, so it's not as restrictive on the athlete. We test in a half kneeling position, isokinetic, push as hard as possible. Okay, we do the same thing on a pull, so we're looking at pushing, now we're looking at pulling. We go in a half kneel position, isokinetic, as much force as they can generate through a pull. One thing to note, most of our lower body measures are relative because we relate it back to skating, so we want to know how they're moving their own center of mass. As soon as we get to upper body testing, we're looking at absolute values, because now it comes back to a little bit more of a combative situation. Can you move an opponent that might be bigger than you or smaller than you? But it doesn't really matter. You're going to have to compete against a lot of different shapes of athlete. Our repeat sprint ability test, so again, I talked about that. We want to know how much work can you do in a short amount of time, and can you do it again and again and again. We've used traditional Wingate testing. We've used a variety of tests. The athletes hate them all. During COVID, we kind of stumbled into something that has absolutely not been validated. It's a very field-based test, but we have 3 VersaClimbers in our gym. And if you're familiar with a VersaClimber, if you're not, the machine that it looks like you're climbing straight up, right? If you've been on one, they're pretty brutal. So we were actually using it as a training session. We created a little bit of a game out of it, a little bit of a competition, and not to get into the full story, but it became the team test. So I say Team VersaClimber there. I'm going to show you a video of it, but it's a brutal test, but somehow fun. It's competitive, and it's something that we call it our own, but it's a really cool thing for us. The next one that we've really focused on recently, and there's been a lot of conversation within our organization around shooting and how much rotational power is related to shooting a hockey puck, talking to a lot of the Major League Baseball teams in the U.S. There doesn't seem to be a real good consensus on how to test rotational power. A lot of people either don't do it, don't agree on it, don't have a solution for it. One thing that the quantum does very well is the rotational power test is really, really easy to do. We use a basic handle. We do a 3-load test. We use 4, 8, 12 kilos. We do a very basic load velocity profile, and I have a video of that. But it's a messy video, but it's a really easy test, and it's something that we'll do on the left and right side, and I think has a lot of value for us. So like I touched on, the isokinetic lateral squat, we're looking at relative max force. When we first got the machines, we were doing this on a single column. Athletes started to get stronger and stronger, and all of a sudden we realized they had maxed out the force capacity of the single quantum. It was everyone kept getting 2,200 newtons. Peter helped me solve that problem. We then figured out how to rig, this thing up to create the synchro version of this. Our strongest athletes now will put up 3,700 peak newtons on a single leg. That's across about 2 seconds of time under tension. So it's an amazing test. It's an amazing exercise. We've seen an incredible adaptation to it. So it's just, again, it's prevalent in our program. You can see the protocol summaries there, and we'll get into it in the practicals. Anyone can ask questions about it, but I've just noted off to the right side how we actually set the machine up. Our vertical jump, it's a hands-on hips protocol for body weight, and then we'll do a trap bar version. But we look at relative average power, so that's just sort of our KPI out of the jump. I think there's lots of good metrics that can be used. Takeoff velocity or impulse power are great. We've just hung our hat on average relative power. Again, we want to see how the athlete moves their own center of mass. In the isokinetic press, we're taking peak force, we divide by body weight. So again, it's not divided by body weight, it's just the absolute force. So we want to just see how much they can actually produce in a pressing action. Identical in a pull. So we're in both times, we're in a half kneel position, pushing and pulling. We do the 3-load explosive rotation test. We get the load velocity profile. We're sort of focusing right now on that predicted peak power. VersaClimber, the protocol on this, it's a 12-minute test. We run the clock for 12 minutes. There's 3 athletes per climber. Originally, it was switch whenever you want, kind of like ice hockey, right? We have live substitutions, change when you want. Athletes very quickly figured out that roughly 30 seconds was ideal. So again, the competitiveness, they'd sort of game planned this. So now we've just standardized it. Every 30 seconds, there's a substitution. So you work for 30 seconds, you rest for 60. The test itself is team-oriented, which is kind of unique, right? So, and we pick teams. So when we have 50 athletes, we've kind of strategically put certain players with certain players and the superstars with young guys, and there's a little bit of a strategy here. What's cool about it is this score, your score is the team score. So it's the most feet climbed in 12 minutes. It's awful, but we do track individual output, so we have to have a little bit of a fail-safe on. We have athletes that come in completely unprepared, so we need some other follow-up metrics. But team numbers the KPI for us there. I didn't touch on it in the last slide, but for body composition, and this is really important for us as well. We have a DEXA scan in-house. We scan every other month. Body fat percent's an easy one. However, it's not our primary or not our only big metric. I think because we have a lot of developing athletes, one of the really important ones for us is a ratio of muscle mass to height. So we take their standing height and when we divide by their total lean mass, so we end up with a ratio there. We know very clearly within a bandwidth of what the athlete should be to be considered an NHL player in a physically mature body. So it's a really, really nice guideline for us to sort of, track athletes' progression along as they physically mature and get ready for professional hockey. Here's a couple of examples here of the tests I had talked about. So the lateral squat, this is one of my strength coaches. So he's going a little bit quicker than we would actually test. We'd slow them down and have them reset in between reps. Okay, so they load down on the pressing leg. There's a little bit of control on that, which would be his right foot. We would have it set wide enough so that when they finish the push, they're actually over top of that foot. So there's a little bit of standardization across that. He's also holding his hands in a standard position so that there's not a lot of, random body sway. But you can see the setup there with the synchros and the foot plate, and then it goes around the waist belt. This is the explosive rotation. Again, one of my young athletes, it's a little bit hairy, not to make a joke of it, but he's just demonstrating how we do this rotation. When we actually test it, there's a little bit more control over the foot placement, but we'll do that under 3 loads. One of the things, there should have been a no flyweight setting on this, but that little piece of metal is always something we got to watch for because they generate quite a bit of velocity and we don't want them knocking their teeth out if they have some left. Here's our half kneel press. Okay, very similar. You'll see the pull, but you can see the setup we've made with that rope. So it creates a little bit of space, so it's not creating some rubbing or abrasion on the arm. So here's the VersaClimber. As you can see, these are our development athletes. Typically, when we're doing this, the music's cranked to 10. There's a lot of excitement, a lot of energy. You can see them getting ready to change, right? They get in and they get going. And so each athlete will get 8 30-second efforts. Thanks, everyone.